My name is Michael McVeigh. I'm a professor at Eastern Michigan University. Thanks for attending my paper presentation. Designing Digital Assessment Strategies in Teacher Preparation. So, new teachers need to know a great deal, obviously, about how to identify and use tools. They also have to place them in the context of their own classrooms. And I've listed a few right here: selecting the tool, determining the setting, determining the ways of organizing its use, etc. And the development of a strategy for assessing learning in the classroom can also be a gateway for thinking about the use of technology in lesson planning and instructional design, in which learner outcomes are aligned with assessments in an intentional manner. The rest of this paper basically unpacks this single sentence. So this paper examines the challenges faced by one EPP in developing the skills required to create, review, and these assessments, as well as examine potential benefits of the use of digital assessment tools for collaborative interactions and learner engagement. Assessment truly is an integral part of schooling. It's necessary to determine whether or not teachers have met their instructional goals. That's the basics. I'm going to start with the assumption that assessment is part of the ecosystem in which new teachers will find themselves. So there are so many technological advances that it's really relatively simple to assign scores to simple quizzes with highly constrained or convergent responses. That's not the way I envision technology, and that's not the way a lot of technologists and educators view technology. We now have advances that, such as shared documents and form submission tools that add a huge amount of potential for formative feedback to be provided to the learners. And in addition to teacher candidates, even if they develop the skills of using formative feedback tools, the process of eliciting quality responses from learners still relies heavily on the skills and insights of a well-trained teacher. We're not going to talk about that much in this paper. So here's a case study. One university developed an approach to training teacher candidates that required them to create a digital assessment strategy for teaching in an online learning environment. So to ensure that entry-level teachers were prepared, one EPP seized on this change to graduation requirements in our state and began intentional efforts to prepare us to teach online by providing each teacher candidate with their very own individual course shell and requiring them to develop a thematic unit specifically directed to learners in an online environment. We assumed snow days back a decade ago. Now, we're dealing with pandemic issues and emergency remote online teaching, and suddenly teaching online is a much more realistic possibility for my future teachers. The teacher educators had to prepare candidates to develop a digital assessment strategy that will help them remote and monitor engagement or assess learning. So let's get into it. This concept of micro-teaching isn't new, and we'll skip over this part, but you may want to ask something about it in the questions later. In the early days of developing this learning event or the online learning experience, the only assessment expectation we had was they had to have some sort of summative assessment. That changed after a year or two. We started to examine and insist on formative assessments as well as the summative assessments that could be infused into the online learning environment. And eventually we began to frame assessment strategies more precisely and created a number of frameworks. And one framework that proved helpful was to have candidates examine assessments along a range from the highly constrained or to the more open-ended or divergent. And we'll talk about Gifford and Scalise a fair bit in a bit. And in fact, this is the model that we're looking at. At the more constrained end, we have multiple choice, where A, B, or C, one is the correct answer. Categorizing, essays, concept maps, as you can see, things get a little less constrained, more open-ended, and leading to projects, discussions, and we'll dig into examples of what they look like in a bit. I'd like to pass on that slide. as the EPP considered an even more informal formative assessment could add value to the teacher-learner interaction, it was determined that each digital tool that learners brought into the learning process required a review of its value to the learning process. And there are levels of complexity, of course, and skill that could obscure a lack of basic learner understanding, or it might bias a teacher. Again, don't have much time to get into that in this brief presentation. So let's look at the different types of digital assessments that students or teacher candidates can bring into their online lesson plans. We looked at basically multiple choice assignments, really straightforward, really easy to do, somewhat challenging for some people. And in fact, there are a lot of courses designed to train teacher candidates in how to create multiple choice assessments, putting them online these days using Google Forms and the quiz option. And there are many. It makes life easier for the teacher following that pathway. Of course, there are many other tools available to do that. Categorizing and reordering assessments is the next, as we're moving from structured and convergent to divergent assessments. Let's look at this. This is the second type of assessment. For example, placing the proper stages in the water cycle or a life cycle, or mitosis, meiosis, Krebs cycle, nitrogen cycle. There are all sorts of great cycles that students can reorganize and order to demonstrate their understanding of the system. Completion assignments, basic stuff, fill in the blank, respond to a form with online research, basically worksheets. Graphic construction assessments are when you use something like a spreadsheet, a timeline, or a wiki, and you have to manipulate information within the application by adding text and altering it. This is a lot of fun, a very engaging kind of assessment, and very challenging for younger learners. A lot of fun, though, for older learners. Text construction assignments, we're talking about stories, essays, journals, reports, wikis, where they have a lot of choice in how they share their knowledge and their understanding of the topic and the concept. It gets even more complicated with presentation assessments. So in addition now to creating the text, they also have to select color schemes, images, transition features, editing techniques, things like that, that could distract the teacher from seeing what the actual content is. Finally, moving up to demonstration assessments. So these are very divergent, where they have to learners have to demonstrate knowledge or understanding of concepts through the recording of things like podcasts, animations, or videos, skits, plays, raps, dance, scientific experiments, computer coding. All of those fall under demonstration assessments. And finally, discussion assessments. Just as demonstration assessments allow learners to synthesize artifacts created over time, edited, reframed at the learner's convenience, is what the demonstration tools show. At the discussion level of assessment, learners have to engage in the presentation under the glare of real-time engagement with the concepts, having a debate, doing an interview with somebody, digging up information on the spur of the moment. So now, the teacher educators in this institution were graded on 4 key areas for their learning experience. It had to be functional and interact with learners. There had to be a clear sequence of activities leading from the introduction to the final assessment. There had to be tools and activities, of course, that were age appropriate and aligned with content level grade expectations, or grade level content expectations, sorry. And finally, assessment strategies had to include summative and formative assessments, as well as, and we starting to insist on this now, collaborative work, engaging other students in the class. Professors who taught the course wrote comments about each of these, and in hindsight, or in a post-hoc analysis, we pulled together about 1,200 of these comments just to get a sense of where these lessons were, how engaging they were, and the sorts of comments that our teacher educators found in them. So we looked at early childhood education, lower elementary, upper, middle, high school, all subjects with the exception of PE and special education and a lot of the CTE courses. So the smallest of the categories was childhood ed with about 12%. In high school, we had about 28%. So the comments that you read here are spread across a wide range of grade levels. 21% of those lessons used a collaborative experience, which is interesting. 80% included web research. Sadly, 60% of those were no more than completing worksheets, somewhat disappointing. A very few percent, possibly as high as 10%, involved assessments such as presentations, skits, debate preparation, podcasts. They were actually, interestingly, from the grades 5, 6, and the high school science and social studies area. The ones that were least engaging with students, sadly, were the high school mathematics lessons. A number of the excellent strategies recognize time on task estimates and multiple opportunities for assignments. The less favorably regarded by the teacher educators did not have a clear sense that accommodations had to be made for learners that were out of sight. Basically, they assumed the learners were still in front of them. So let's look at some of the implications. We'll go through them really, really quickly. Assessing digital artifacts is an area that EPPs need to talk about with their students. We need to understand that our teacher candidates need some clear guidance in how to assess digital artifacts so they are not blown away by the flash, but instead learn how to isolate the content being assessed from the presentation of the artifacts. There are a lot of modern algorithms and tools that can create some really beautiful presentations. But what we need to focus on are things like universal design for learning, culturally sustaining pedagogy, and teacher candidates have to focus on language use, awareness of audience, things that go beyond the glitz and flash of the presentation. The selection of assessments is a really big thing. Teacher candidates used to rely on quizzes and tests and overlooked a lot of formative assessments. They need to think in terms of how to engage students, to get feedback from the students. Now, these are things that we've discovered work really well in online settings, but work especially well in face-to-face settings. Having our future teachers think in terms of how to engage students and get authentic feedback from them using some of these tools is quite valuable. A lot of implication 3, avoidance of collaborative engagement. What we discovered was that our future teachers, our teacher candidates, were hesitant to engage with collaboration in the classroom, one of the most powerful tools for engaging, and yet we found that these future teacher candidates, and we're talking thousands of them, were really at their heart hesitant to engage in collaborative engagement. And this is an area for future research, figuring out the why and figuring out how to overcome. 4th of 5 here, the absence of real learner feedback. Sadly, it was a time issue. We had only best guesses for how real students would engage with the lessons. And we're looking at different ways of getting our teacher candidates to teach, perhaps having a little teaching in an online setting as part of their initial teacher preparation. Look to Kevin Graziano for information in that area. Finally, differentiation of the learning event. There are a lot of tricks that we had to engage over the years to modify this assignment for different ages of learners. A lot of different focus in the course had to focus on creating digital manipulatives, videos of read aloud stories, things like that for the youngest learners, and ways of getting our youngest students to share their information with their teachers using cameras, or now finally they can use tools like Flip, formerly Flipgrid, and other great tools. So sadly, I'm not able to dig deeply into this one, but it is an issue that we discovered we needed to focus more on. So in conclusion, thinking about digital assessments has definitely evolved. When teacher candidates work within their own online course shells, there are places for curating digital resources, opportunities to practice with structure and pacing, and they also provide a framework for selecting the most appropriate assessment tools for their learners.